Great. Look, I think it's 2 minutes past. We'll get going. So as I say, thank you very much to everyone for joining us for this third session in the webinar series that the PRCA's Global COVID-19 Taskforce has put in place. Today, we're discussing the all-important issue of safeguarding your organization's resilience and recovery. And that will obviously be an issue very much front of mind for any professional communicator, whether they're in agency or in-house. So I'm delighted to be joined on the line by Mark Hutchin and Max Lambertson of Deloitte. Gentlemen, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, pleased to be here.
Super. And as we'll see in a second, Mark and Max have come armed with the firm's very impressive report called The World Remade, which came out at the beginning of April, together with a range of other economic and other research they've been conducting since. Just by way of very brief background, Mark is the reputation lead at Deloitte in the firm's reputation and crisis and resilience team. Joined Deloitte last year following an in-house and agency career which took in senior roles at Williams Racing, Samsung, Fitness First, and Reputation Inc. So a pretty glittering comms career. Max is an economist at Deloitte with a pretty eye-wateringly international career, including time at the Economist Intelligence Unit and the National Democratic Institute. So just very briefly, what we're going to cover today is four things. Firstly, we're going to look at providing a global business perspective on the potential trajectories of COVID-19. We're going to look at different potential macro impacts of the scenarios that Deloitte has explored. We're then going to look at the micro implications for business growth and reputation building. And then finally, we're going to discuss the steps that business leaders and professional communicators should consider to safeguard resilience and recovery. Rather than doing the usual present and Q&A format, today will be something more of a conversation. So please do ask all and any questions that the discussion throws up using the chat function. And I'll try and get those into the conversation as often and as fully as possible. So that's enough from me. Straight over to the stars of the show, Mark and Max. And gentlemen, if you can start with some scene setting in terms of the key findings from the World Remade report, particularly in terms of the scenarios you identified, the changes they might bring about, and any particular impacts on industries or sectors. So Max, I know you had a bit of content to share to kick off the session and the conversation.
Thanks very much, Rod. Yeah, I'll just share my screen because it would be easier to talk through some of the slides of this report, the World Remade report. So this was developed by the Deloitte Global team in cooperation with Salesforce. And the idea is to share a view or several views on scenarios of how the world may develop over the next 3 to 5 years. And the objective is to help leaders explore some of the potential long-term implications of COVID-19. So this is part of Deloitte's resilient leadership framework. So it's those 3 words you can see there: respond, recover, thrive. And so the goal is to move beyond recovering from the crisis to thriving in the long run. And throughout these 4 scenarios that were developed, the idea was to avoid the temptation to conclude that crisis is just going to accelerate changes we've already expected, and instead look at which trajectories have been altered. And so the scenarios were created with 2 underlying criteria in mind: the severity of the pandemic and the level of collaboration between countries. So the severity of the pandemic is pretty self-explanatory. It ranges from the lowest impact of a rapid peak, followed by a sustained decline, all the way to a very high impact, which would include very strong rolling waves of the virus. And level of collaboration, well, that would range from significant coordination between countries, whether it's managing mobility of people, transmission of the disease, and sharing information, to, well, a collapse of the opposite, a collapse of cooperation and little transparency between countries. And so with those two criteria, this sort of matrix you can see here on the right-hand side was created. So you have these four scenarios, and on the x-axis here, you have the severity of the pandemic, and on the y-axis, the level of collaboration. So if we start with the most benign scenario, that was this called passing storm. And in this scenario, basically, effective government collaboration contains the virus. But even in this most benign scenario, the economic damage is nevertheless severe, particularly to small and medium businesses and low-income individuals and communities. In the top right quadrant here, you have the most pessimistic lone wolves scenario. So this sees a series of severe rolling pandemics, a lack of global coordination, and an ineffective policy response. And the outcomes here are the adoption of isolationist policies, so a fragmentation of global supply chains, and increased surveillance. And then in between this most benign outcome, most positive one, we have sort of two in-between scenarios, the good company one and sunrise in the east. In good company, there is government cooperation, but it's not very effective, and the pandemic keeps going on. And so large companies step up as a key part of the solution and consolidate their position relative to their smaller peers. In the sunrise in the east scenario, this is mainly about China and other East Asian countries being the most effective at managing the virus, but the pandemic being much more severe in other regions of the world. And then this crisis then serves as a stepping stone for China to take the reins of global leadership, whether that's with regard to multinational organizations or foreign investment, for global lending, things like that. So it's important to note that these scenarios were developed in March and published in early April. So some aspects of these scenarios may already seem more realistic than others. And what could be useful is just with these scenarios in mind, thinking through implications across several areas. You can see here on the left, so society, tech, economy, environment, and politics. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but I've highlighted some of the more interesting implications for each scenario. So for example, on societal cohesion in the passing storm scenario, you could, for example, expect an increase in appreciation for interpersonal relationships, which would boost societal cohesion. On the economy, for example, in the good company scenario, you could see, as I mentioned before, further concentration of power among large corporates as they're better able to get through the crisis. On the environment, well, in this case, you could kind of think of two quite plausible but contrasting scenarios. One in which there are lack of preparation for this very rare long tail risk of a global pandemic, making increasing appreciation for the need to fight climate change. But you could also think of a scenario where fighting climate change takes a back seat to prioritizing short-term growth to make up for the economic damage of the crisis. And just finally on politics, I think the lone wolf scenario is very interesting here, where you could see a trend towards isolationism as countries react instead of cooperating by hoarding, or whatever it is, resources, technology, or scientific advances. So the idea of these was really just to a suggestion of possible outcomes, not that any of these are necessarily going to happen in their entirety, but it's just useful to think about which scenarios your organization is prepared for and maybe which you might be ignoring. And then with that in mind, what you need to do differently to thrive in each scenario. So Rod, that's just a quick overview of the World Remade scenarios.
Perfect. And, Max, can I abuse the chair and ask a question already, which is looking at the lone wolf scenario and the passing storm, the key driver for which of those comes into being, if they did, is the question of collaboration or lack of. Already there's been a lot of debate about a lack of international collaboration. Are you as Deloitte seeing any early signs about where on that spectrum we are from collaboration to isolation, be it from governments or the private sector?
Yeah, I'd say it's quite a mixed bag, because we obviously can easily find examples in headlines of lack of cooperation, whether it's continued acrimony between the US and China and the World Health Organization. But I think that there's probably even more examples of continued cooperation. So just thinking about the intervention by the Federal Reserve in the US to extend swap lines to other countries, much beyond the scope of what it did in the global financial crisis. And that was at a time where there was perhaps more consensus for global cooperation. So that's noteworthy. In terms of the EU, we had the news yesterday of Germany and France indicating their support for a European Commission financed support fund for the EU, which would be an unprecedented sort of fiscal union for Europe. So that, in a way, has provided impetus for unprecedented cooperation at the EU level. And then with companies, we have plenty of examples of companies in the UK and the US who are cooperating with the government, either sort of tech-related interventions or in the health side of things. So I would still be pretty optimistic in terms of cooperation.
Got it. And actually, there was a question on the Q&A already, which asks whether you might actually see a blend of these scenarios rather than any one of them.
I agree, absolutely. I think you're probably most likely to see something in the middle of that matrix with aspects of all four of those mixed in, absolutely.
So you'll have to come up with a term for whatever the eventual scenario is.
Yep.
Cool. The lone eastern passing storm or similar. Super. Great. Okay. So if there are no further questions on that, then we'll press on. So have you done any other analysis? I know when we were speaking that the World Remade It is a big thing for you, but there may be other insights that you as Deloitte have gleaned over recent weeks. Is there anything additional to this you think might be helpful to share with the audience today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would be very interested in just briefly sharing the work that I've been doing for the Deloitte Chief Strategy Officer for North-South Europe and thinking through how COVID-19 affects businesses and the economy and the long-term implications this has. So this is the structure that we put together to think about it. You can see there the health and economic interplay. So the first two boxes are the health implications. So you have the disease itself and its path, and you have the non-pharma interventions. So all of the non-pharmaceutical measures that have been put in place to limit the spread of the disease. So that's everything ranging from closing schools, limiting travels, to full lockdown, all of those interventions. And once you have a view on what interventions will be used and what the path of the virus will be, you can then think through the impacts to supply and demand. So supply, you could think, what is the impact of airlines if they're required to fly with the middle seat vacant? So that's a supply constraint. On the demand side, what happens if a bunch of people can't get to work, or a bunch of people don't go out even if they're allowed to because they're afraid of catching the virus? And then the final bit, which is the government policy response to try to counteract some of this. So, introducing a furlough scheme so that people's incomes are sustained, or providing liquidity so that companies don't go bust when they're not allowed to function. And once you have a view on all of those things, you can then think through the impact on these themes you have on the right-hand side. So if we have a government taking on a bunch of new debt, does that mean that we will have a period of higher taxation going forward? Or if companies are moving from just-in-time supply chains to just-in-case supply chains, does that mean they have to have permanent excess capacity built into their business model? And what does that mean for their competitiveness? And so with all of this in mind, on the health side, it's important to get a view of the path of the disease. So you might have seen charts like this before. Imperial College has published studies like this. And so the green line is path of the disease, and the red boxes are the periods of lockdown. And so you could see we've already gone through the first big wave of the virus, and we were just exiting the lockdown now, and some countries have already lifted theirs. But based on what the science and epidemiology tells us, as restrictions are eased, barring any sort of game changers, we would need to reimpose restrictions or lockdowns going forward to prevent the virus from getting out of control again. And at the bottom here is a way we developed of thinking about the MPIs with higher the scale of MPI having a higher impact on suppressing the virus. So 10 is a lockdown, and that has been the most effective in limiting new cases of the virus, but it also has the most dramatic impact on economic activity. And so then the question goes to, as you go down the scale and you start unwinding towards maybe say 6 or 7, what does that do to the virus? And then how much activity comes back? But there's a couple other nuances to this, which is even when activity is allowed to come back, unemployment and confidence may limit how much is returned. So if I could just share a couple more slides on this, on the unemployment and confidence bits, I think it's very useful to think through, because early on in the crisis, the interventions or the lockdowns, government policy, it was designed mainly to bridge businesses and households through the crisis, through the lockdown. But now that we know that the lockdown can't be fully lifted, we have to think about what happens when we live in a world of part capacity, of part restrictions. So here, this is just to give you an idea of the scale of what we're dealing with. So different countries have dealt with unemployment differently. The US has done it by increasing unemployment payments. European countries have done it by paying employers to keep employees on payrolls. But either way, we're going to deal with a massive spike in unemployment. Right there, you see this New York Times cover where you have the new, the change in employment in April. So you had 20 million new unemployment claims in April alone, and it's so far off the charts. That chart goes back to World War II, and it's just nothing compared. So it makes you think that it's very unlikely that all of these jobs can be recovered within a few months. But then the other issue to think about is confidence. So even for people who may have kept their jobs or their incomes, how comfortable do they feel going out? This survey here, this was for the UK, this was a YouGov survey, but I've seen similar surveys for other countries, and it asks people how confident they feel going back to different places, even when they're allowed to reopen. And you can see that in a lot of cases, there's still a majority of people who say they are uncomfortable returning to some of these businesses. And this is very important. And just the chart on the right there is really interesting because it's comparing GDP growth in Sweden to the Euro area. And Sweden obviously has gained attention for not having imposed formal lockdown. That said, it hasn't done nothing. It has strongly encouraged people to work from home. It has strongly discouraged people from using public transport, for example. And it's still seen as a very significant decline in activity. Maybe not as significant as countries that have had a full lockdown like the UK or Italy, but the impact has still been severe. So I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not just a matter of restrictions and lockdowns, but about how people feel and how they behave in this new normal that we're living in. And so that's what we've been thinking through in terms of our economic scenarios.
Got it. And to that point, another great question on the chat from Jocelyn, which is that in the UK, do you have a sense of which scenario we're leaning towards? Her sense is that we've been leaning lone wolf in terms of our measures in the UK. Any sense of the UK specific scenario we might be heading towards?
In terms of the World Remade report, it's hard to associate the UK with one specific scenario. I think I would maybe associate it with the passing storm scenario. Even though it's the most optimistic one, it still accounts for quite a lot of economic damage. But based on what we know, the lifting of restrictions is happening extremely cautiously. And people are also going to behave much more differently than they did before the lockdown. So that might also help limit how fast the virus rebounds as things are lifted. And we're seeing the government now introduce new policies to help us get through this new, much longer period of part restrictions. So in our scenario, we have a core scenario on the economics team at Deloitte. So we have collapsing growth in the second quarter during time that the full lockdown was in place. And then over the rest of the year, we have a recovery of activity, but only partially because of the impacts on confidence and employment I mentioned before. And the Economist had a very good piece on this a couple weeks ago where they talked about the 90% economy. And the idea is that because of the restrictions and the inability of businesses to operate with the models that they have in place from pre-COVID times, you really have only 90% of the economy that can really function. And so we had that sort of hard cap on activity limiting the economy to return to where it was pre-COVID anytime soon.
Got it. Brilliant. So some fantastic scene setting. Max, unless you have anything else by way of context, I'd like to move us on to Mark. And we saw the continuum you've created of response, respond, recover, thrive. And it would be great if you could just take us through in a little more detail what that continuum looks like and how it works. And then perhaps something on what you feel the implications of all of this are for different areas of marketing communication writ large, by which I mean corporate reputation, issues and risk, employee engagement, brand and consumer marketing, for example. So maybe starting with that continuum.
Yes, of course. Happy to, Rod, and good afternoon to everybody on the call. Apologies in advance if my 3-year-old son walks in wanting to talk about fire engines. It may actually be more interesting what I say. Yes, so just as Max has talked about, 2 things actually to refer back to. Number one, from the very beginning, Deloitte has based its support to clients around a framework, not unsurprisingly, with the idea of resilience at its very core. And because we've had quite a lot of conversations with C-suite executives, the search for a manifestation of that, which was about resilient leadership. And I think that's an interesting concept, not just for sort of global CEOs, but really all of us, whether we're running agencies or running functions within companies. And some of the characteristics of that, I think, apply both to how we act individually and then how we respond in terms of our own businesses and services. A few of the 5 qualities that they associated with a resilient leader were mission first. And I think to Max's second point about the good company, from a reputation point of view, I think we'd all agree a lot of companies have stood up and risen to the challenge of being a good company and a responsible business in this pandemic, and have showed both mission and purpose. The second point, which it's been played out every day, is that speed is much more beneficial and advantageous rather than elegance. You know, not waiting for the perfect decision, but moving fast almost every day, starting again to make quick decisions about what to do, when and how, and reacting to these changes. So thirdly, the idea of communicating in a human way, or designed from the human heart. Often business leaders and corporate communicators struggle with the idea of, frankly speaking, with any kind of humanity. And yet this particular crisis event has really majored on how can you show empathy to people that are struggling? How can you show empathy to your employees that are anxious? How can you show empathy to suppliers and customers that are vulnerable? Yes, so there's been a big challenge, I think, on communicating with social awareness and emotional awareness. Owning your own narrative, which again plays right into the comms playbook, about having a very strong vision of what kind of company you want to be in this crisis, and pursuing that. And then finally, staying focused on the big picture. I think all are lessons that a resilient company and a resilient leader can play to. And so the second point, the more rational point I wanted to make, was we use this framework to really take clients through a journey in terms of decision making. Nearly all of us have been involved in the kind of day-to-day, hour-to-hour response at the moment. How can we continue to provide services, function as a business, connect to our employees despite the disruption? And that's been complex, particularly for an international business. It's changing all the time. But I feel like coming up to this point in where we are, a lot of companies have got into a rhythm and would feel like that their BAU or their response to this crisis is sort of not so much in control, but is definitely firmed up and needs to be where it needs to be. So we've been trying to do with clients is to get them to focus, and that was the point of the World Remade report, which was how do we recover from this in a responsible way but a viable way. And then, are there any headwinds behind us in terms of changed consumer attitudes, political attitudes, social attitudes that will set the business up to strive in the 3 to 5 year time frame, and how to pivot to that and make the right decisions.
Mark, may I just interject with since you'd mentioned decision making, there's a great question just come in from Nigel. I'm guessing Nigel Sarbut's given the brilliance of the question, which is that he says 4 of those leadership values are concerned with long-term behaviours. How does that square with the demands of the quarterly reporting cycle?
Well, I don't think that's gone away. The tension between making a profit and sustainable performance to fulfill your duties to shareholders. I mean, that's been an ever-present, and there's been a little bit of grace in this last 2 months in the reporting side, because it's obviously been hard to close your accounts as a PLC. The boards of companies, non-executive CEOs, are very sensitive to seeming out of touch with regards to their compensation, bonuses, dividends to shareholders. There's a lot of restraint shown around that, and rightly so. But I mean, interestingly, there was a quote given by the recently stood down CEO of Unilever, Paul Pullman, and he talks about this idea of build back better. And I think Unilever as a company has probably stood out in the past 10 years of being able to both deliver performance-wise and reputation-wise. And that's, I think, the model for a lot of CEOs going forward. My personal view in this crisis is that it's been a chance for business to really show its character, a little bit more of its morality, a little bit more of its sort of human side. Some CEOs have risen to that challenge. I mean, we were talking earlier about the Airbnb CEO. It took a lot of time, emotion, and passion for him to write that 4,000-word letter. So I think that's the blueprint to answer the question, is try and take out of the legacy of this a mandate to be a bit more human in the way executives and boards communicate. And that would be a good win for a lot of us.
Right. And can I ask a supplementary, if I may, just on that? Is, we're obviously not starting with a blank sheet of paper. ESG was already on the rise, both as a principle and a practice. TCFD, the rise of the B Corp. Do you think we're going to see things like ESG accelerated in practical terms? I know you're going to cover it a little bit later, but it sits nicely with Nigel's question.
It's hard to tell. We have a sustainability practice, and their opinion is that companies would be making a mistake if they thought that one of the legacies of this was to somehow downgrade climate change, reducing emissions, sustainability. They feel like it's been a dry run. The COVID-19 and the global pandemic has been a dry run for getting to net zero emissions. And in fact, it's opened up a lot of people's imaginations that things can change. And I know it's a bit of a cliche to talk about the clean air and the empty skies. And we wouldn't advise a pandemic as a policy instrument, but their view is that a lot more is possible now than ever imagined. And whilst it might be difficult if you're an industry in contraction like travel to do that it's only going to accelerate. And I'd probably agree with that point of view. I don't know what Max thinks.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how your point on things that weren't considered possible before are now being adopted rapidly, whether that's the scale of the government policy response or businesses completely rechanging their business models because they're forced to. So I would agree. I think that this is a huge opportunity and that governments, what we see with cities taking this as an opportunity to entrench bike cycle lanes and pedestrian zones, or take this as an opportunity to put into place these policies that would have more of an ESG tint to them. Yeah, I agree.
Just to give an example then of how the framework has worked, and a lot of these 3 phases are overlapping. but we've done a little bit of work with a well-known Swedish furniture retailer, and I think even before the month of March was out, they already had their R&D teams thinking about, you know, some fundamental changes to their marketplace in the recovery phase, and principally, you know, the whole idea of where the office is, and it used to be in a building somewhere, you know, fixed, and we went to it 5 days a week, is now completely turned upside down. And their insight was that a lot of people would be working permanently now from their homes, creating a market then for the home office, or the inbuilt office, or even the mobile office, you know, the Brompton bike for offices, you know. So they've now charged their R&D teams with operationalizing these product ideas and getting out ahead in the market in terms of, you know, new products that capture the sort of changing dynamic in the industry. And I think that's the blueprint a lot of companies, if possible, need to follow. And that's what we mean by recover, pivoting to new opportunities, if possible. Just to bring it really into the world of communications, knowing that it's not going to be a linear recovery for economies or for how we do business. We did talk to corporate communicators and corporate affairs leaders in terms of what they saw as the hot topics and challenges coming ahead, both in the short term as they finish the response to the pandemic, and then moving into the long term. One of the standout themes in this, I think, if I can talk to one or 2 points, is that the transition from the short-term intense response about employee welfare and customer welfare into getting out in front of how consumer attitudes are going to change. So one of the areas that they're most looking for help and advice, I think, from their agencies and from their advisors, is to make sense of how people's attitudes to certain industries and products have changed. Can they decode that, how that changed, where are the insights, and then adapt both messaging campaigns and even product strategies to that. That was probably the single biggest sort of unknown. And where you have unknowns, clients have unknowns, then I think that's an opportunity for smart advisors to take them on a journey. I think there will be another point to sort of reflect on, is that the reality for many of us is that we will be dealing all with tough news. I mean, the Airbnb letter by the chief executive brings into view the fact is that we'll all have to make difficult decisions, and some of those will be highly scrutinized. They will be in the newspapers. And so, just as the Airbnb CEO has said, try and be the best unemployer you can be. So how can you manage those decisions in a responsible way, if possible? And then finally, working with government and local authorities and regulators in the next 24 months is going to be very different, new sets of priorities, and anticipating that in your communications and public affairs were some of the hot topics going forward.
Mark, can I just throw in a question? You'll have spotted, I know, that the business risk supplement that Raconteur produced in the UK Sunday Times at the weekend had head of comms as one of the 5 most in-demand roles post-COVID, whatever that means. There was a great question, which is that in terms of the accountability of leaders across the dimensions and functional areas that you've covered, are you implying that comms is across these? In other words, is this a prime opportunity in terms of shifting tone, positioning, and recalibrating the reputation?
Yeah, without question. The best answer I can give is that our chairman, Nick Owen, hosted a call like this with the chairs of a number of quoted companies in UK PLC, and one of the strongest pieces of feedback was that each of the chairs talking of how much they, and this isn't a surprise, but they genuinely valued the comms skill set. It really comes into effect in situations like this. If you're a company that has planned for some of these types of situations, you would hope that your assumptions, your business continuity, your supply chain strategies can cope with this. So where it often comes down to is the sort of touch and tone of your communications, how sensitive you are to, to complex changing of people's attitudes, being sensitive to the media cycle, and therefore that judging what's going to be acceptable externally in the public space, as well as what employees feel. So these are all skill sets I think comms really, works well on. Will that prevail as we go through? We all know in a downturn that marketing communications often is, put under the axe in terms of its spending. So I think we will go back quite quickly to having to justify and show the business case for comms. But, we talk to a lot of C-suite, and I think where you have volatility, and we definitely have volatility according to Max's scenarios, you have risk. And where you have risk, I think you need, comms capability to navigate where the bear traps are and to explain the changes coming. And when you think of some of the industries that will be structurally changed, travel, hospitality, I think you're going to need, agile, effective comms to kind of take people on that journey. And I would hope that the boards and leaders of businesses are faithful to that idea.
And from what you've said, and again, I'm just reflecting a question in the chat, does that mean that perhaps the corporate side of the comms shop, and I'm generalizing on purpose, is likely to be more ascendant than the marketing focused one, as corporate advisors are brought into business continuity planning, resilience planning, or is that too much of a generalization from what you've seen?
Yeah, we've thought about this in advance of today's call, and I appreciate there's a lot of thoughts on the slide. I think I would say up front that let's have a reality check here. As Max says, there are tough times ahead. Businesses will be shrinking, budgets will be shrinking. They'll be spent on absolutely critical activities, whether that generates sales or manufacturing of products. I think potentially some boards and business leaders will retrench in terms of their mindsets. They won't be ambitious. They won't want to stand out. So for all of us in the communications industry, I think we're going to have to think quite laterally and two-dimensionally in terms of where the opportunities to play. I see 4 ahead, and they kind of cover the whole comms industry. Number one, you rightly talk about helping companies manage disruption, and that often plays to the sector of crisis comms, corporate communications. Number 2, agile recovery. I think that can be really any kind of comms agency is helping a business work out how it can recover in terms of lost custom, attracting customers back into gyms or hotels or coffee shops, and really just sort of timing the communications rhythm so brands and products are back in people's front of mind. The third area is something more long-term and substantial, and that's really in the area of, I think, the kind of era of glitz and bling are going to be over for a long time. People want to hear new messages from brands. It'll be a lot more about solidarity, connections, shared experiences, and therefore imagining brand conversations for post COVID-19 will be an area businesses need help. And then finally, this idea of resilience, which may be something for financial PRs, but I think it's something for all of us. How do you ensure that your product, service, your story, your function can stand up to shocks like this? Because I think we're quite comfortable as an industry performing in the good times, and we've got to get better at coping with shocks like this. And if you can do that, I think then you'll win out. So those are the 4 areas I think that have opportunities for all of us in the communications world.
I'm just going to ask a question of the audience as to whether they agree with your provocative statement that glitz and bling are over, because it'll be interesting to see whether those from the marketing end of the Marcom spectrum agree with that. We talked as well, Mark and Max, about changes to the consulting model in terms of reputation and marketing communications consulting. Could you just give us your thoughts on that? Because I know it was an area you were particularly keen to cover.
Yeah, I'm just talking personally in terms of working for a professional services firm. You know, we can already see that there's a lot of thinking being done in terms of adapting to the kind of normal we now live in. And that's everything from reorganization of the physical space, which is going to be quite dramatic, I think, for all of us. Getting out of the mindset that you've got to be in one place to make decisions. How we deliver our products and services. You know, if you're in the business of running media relations programs or meeting people or running events, I mean, you're going to need a contingency ability to deliver those, and Deloitte's quite like that as well. How we price our products, we're looking at a lot. You know, reflecting the fact that, you know, various companies have challenging balance sheets and visibility of earnings. So we're going to have to be quite agile around that, and even really the programming of our own staff, how we deploy them and where, and how flexible that is. So, you know, it may not be possible. You know, Deloitte's a big company with a lot of people that can think about this, but just, you know, holding up all of your business operations and assumptions to how you consult and putting them through this change prism, I think is a sensible thing to be doing right now.
Great. You'll be pleased to hear that the consensus thus far on the chat is that bling and glitz are indeed over, given austerity, given that companies will be financially limited. So I think your instinct there is borne out by our focus group of 2 responses thus far on the chat. Yeah,
look, and I was as much as anybody devastated that Love Island is gone from our TV screens for 12 months, and I'm sure it was painful for the ITV board to let it go, but you know, that would be one area that I can see some mini reputational issues, where you have, you know, high street brands, retail brands desperate to get footfall and customers in shops, you know, and they just misjudge the mood. But and they may have teams stocked with product PRs, brand PRs, and maybe not call them, you know, the other side of the fence. Yeah.
I think it's fair to say we've had more energy on this webinar around the loss of Love Island than nearly anything else.
Yeah.
So, you know, is there a tension with glitz and bling being over? I just don't know at this stage. And I'm not fighting the corner for glitz and bling, to be clear.
One interestingly, I mean, two points to make off that. If you're a brand that's kind of, you know, interestingly, you take Ryanair and Michael O'Leary. You know, Michael O'Leary's been on for those in the UK, and you know, we all love the Gobby Irishman, but he's been on the radio constantly, essentially fighting for his old business model. You know, he wants the planes up immediately. He's trying to own the conversation. He's trying to bend the government to support, you know, their business plan. And I think he's being true to his brand and Ryanair's. And so if you feel that's the right course for your brand, you know, go for it. And that will pay back for you. All I'm saying is that sort of self-indulgent type of, you know, PR. I think it's just, there's no real market for it probably for the next year or two.
Yeah, although there's an interesting nuance that Kerry's just put up there, that I'm a celebrity coming back to help boost tourism in Australia. It's almost like glamour with a purpose, I think, is the underlying point, which I think is really, yeah, tone is everything, says Laura. I absolutely agree. Yeah. And can I just quickly jump back to one of the points on your slide about internal comms and employee engagement and the role of psychology? Because I think the point is incredibly well made about the need to demonstrate tangible business value and outcomes rather than outputs. Do you see a change in employee engagement that puts measurable psychology even more front and center than it was for those who were already using psychology as the core of their approach?
Well, I would hope so, for 2 reasons. So When we spoke to some comms leaders, they were reflecting quite a big shift in their kind of work plans and priorities towards internal communications. If it wasn't the number one focus area for their teams, it was sort of number two. And I don't think that's going to change. I think that's going to stay with us. And so the second thing you have is the disruption of the office, and the idea of having an office, and the office sets the culture. If that's all kind of been thrown in the air, that's even so. So you not only do you have to be intense and quick and fast with your comms, because people want to know what's going on, they want to feel assured and confident. You're also going to have to deal with this disruption. So both of those add up to, I think, a kind of change moment for those in internal comms, and I would support a lot more investment in that area. And then the third thing you mentioned, the psychology, is interesting. I would work out roughly what type of. So, for example, if you're a gym company and you know that the vast majority of your staff are probably average age of a PT is like 25, they don't have a computer, they live through Instagram. So I would work out the psychology of what type of learner they are, what kind of individual they are, and adapt my comms to that and their current psychological state, which will obviously be one of anxiety. Yeah, so that would bring a lot more rigor to the profession, maybe that it's had in the past.
Yeah, and I think, and at the risk of being seen to plug, I mean, a team of us got together and launched something last week called the Decision Circle, which was based specifically on the decisions that people are taking are complex and multifaceted. Therefore, rather than going, we need a psychologist separate from a comms person, separate from a business resilience person, you need to think about them in a rounded way. So I think that question of decision making to me seems, and decision support seems particularly important. Great. So we have about 10 minutes left. I've just got one question which I was holding back, and it's a macroeconomic question, which is that as confidence starts to return, do you think that the global markets are going to react to rumors and reports of emerging new diseases, probably not pandemics? And does that mean we're in for decades of volatility as those rumors circulate?
That's a good question. I think markets and people in general are often very influenced by recency bias. So I think hoping that this pandemic will be well behind us in 5-10 years. And I think that we aren't necessarily in a new phase, or any rumors of a new disease 10 years from now will have the same impact, because people will anticipate it being of the scale of COVID-19. And in general, in markets, people have pointed out how optimistic markets look right now relative to what's happening in the economy and how much longer we have to go to get out of this. But the point is that markets are supposed to be forward-looking. They're supposed to account for the expected returns of a company in the future. And so even if we're in the trough right now, whether that's sentiment or activity, there's an idea that, well, growth can only go one way but up from where we currently are. Also understanding that there seems to be widespread consensus for significant government support and intervention, which was not necessarily a given in the last crisis. And any news like we had for the vaccine in the US yesterday tends to indeed boost the market. But then when we have other news about unemployment or the success of different companies in this new environment, that can also affect the market. So it's complicated.
Is that your new Facebook COVID-19
exactly
status?
right.
It's complicated. I think that's very fair to say. I'm just looking at the chat and the Q&A to see if we've got other questions coming in. I'll ask one if we don't, which is that we're seeing that the people talked about COVID as the great leveler, as if everybody would be treated equally, and then latterly it's everyone's going to be working from home. And it strikes me that the people from working from home will, and I'm generalizing, broadly be middle class, potentially university educated knowledge workers. And I just kind of wonder, and I was talking to someone about this yesterday, whether we're going to see a new feudalism, by which I mean, under feudal times, the rich were locked up behind their gates, and the team downstairs would make sure that they were fed and watered, and the people out on the estate would make sure they were served with everything else. Do you think there's a risk of a really polarized society where people spend more time at home and continue to be ungrateful to those who make that possible? So, the idea that key workers will be better respected and better regarded, could it go completely the other way?
Well, just on the first point, I think there's been a very unequal impact on workers from the crisis. So I don't think it has been a leveler by any means, given that I think that, Robert Reich wrote a piece last week. He's former U.S. Labor Secretary, and he said that the crisis had created 4 categories of workers. And I think he if I remember correctly, it was those who kept their job and can work from home, those who lost their jobs, those who are required to go to their jobs because they're key workers, and those who've forgotten either because they're in the informal unpaid work. And so I think it's important to think about how this plays out, and the fact that those at most risk of losing jobs are also tend to be low and middle income workers as well. And that's really important for the recovery, because coming out of the global financial crisis, a lot of job creation in retail, accommodation, restaurant work. And that's the very sectors that are currently not allowed to operate. So that is very concerning. But I think we are seeing unprecedented support for key workers. I can't predict whether or not that will cause societal change or that will last. But I think given the scale of the damage and the amount of people affected by this, even if there are different divisions, I think it's impossible to ignore. And there seems to be widespread consensus and little moralizing that we saw in the last crisis, where some people were seen as being responsible and others not. No one is held individually responsible for not being able to work because of COVID-19. So that would make me hopefully tentatively optimistic about how society could come out of this. I don't know, Mark, if you have thoughts on this.
No, but I was listening to LBC last Saturday.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, things are that bad. And I think it was Sajid Nara, I think is the name of the presenter. But his hypothesis was that, like a lot of, for example, world wars we've had, that it will kind of change the rules of the game with regard to some big assumptions around the state. And it was paving the way for this idea of a universal basic income. And you never know with that stuff. I don't know. I'd be very interested in the next UK election in 4 years' time or 5 years' time, whether the legacy of this experience moves people towards public services, community, those kinds of issues, and away from individual, Tory ideologies. Not making a commitment either way, but potentially that's the swing that could happen, and would be no bad thing, frankly.
Yeah, and someone in the Q&A made the point that, in principle, in the UK at least, and I see it with friends around the world, key workers and municipal workers are being far better regarded. But as the impact of public debt kicks in, potentially austerity returns, municipalities and local authorities may simply not have the money to make that commitment and that respect real. There was another great question, thank you for bringing so many of them in, which is there, because we're all obsessed with COVID-19, are there any major black swans or issues that we are failing to spot, just as COVID was arguably foreseeable, and just as the 2008 crash was foreseeable for those who've seen the Great Short, or whatever it was called?
Yeah, The Big Short.
Big Short, sorry, yes.
I don't have an answer to that, but I would direct people to, and you've got to be a bit of a geek to read all of these things, but if you go to the World Economic Forum publishes a risk register every year, and they've got, I think, the top 20 potential risks. And I think for this year was the first ever year, the top 5 were all environmental.
Environmental, yeah.
Yeah, but in that, it unpacks a lot of detail about other types of, I think somebody's just mentioned them, things like, nationalism, economic nationalism and things like that. And we can already see the anti-China sentiment, you know, being curated by various countries. So that the answer might lie in that area. But as I think the other thing I'd point out is whether you're in crisis communications or that side of our industry, now is the time to introduce, you know, new types of unthinkable scenarios to your crisis planning, because I think it was fair to make the accusation that a lot of pandemic plans and a lot of crisis plans were insufficient, let's say, to cope with what we've gone through.
Well, I often say when I'm doing crisis training, you know, the old quote that 9/11 was not a failure of government, it was a failure of imagination. And I think that's, you know, that's exactly the point you're making. It's a really good one. The imagination and creativity in scenario planning seems very important. I'm just looking, since we have 3 minutes left, if there are any lots of great comments. I'm just seeing if there are any other questions. For the two of you, is there anything else that you wish you'd been asked? That sounds like a job interview question, but I'll ask it anyway.
I'm not sure. I think one point to make is the difference between uncertainty and risk. And so early on in a crisis like this one, there's just a whole lot of uncertainty. And the problem with that is that it's you're dealing with unknowns, which makes it very difficult to plan. But then as you get more and more information, that uncertainty turns into a risk. And risk is much more manageable because financial markets can price risk, businesses can make scenarios and plan for. So yeah, I think it's a key distinction and also a reason for optimism. As time goes on, we just get more and more information about COVID-19, about the effectiveness of different policies. And so even the risks abound, absolutely, but the risks can be managed and uncertainty do not.
Yeah, you broke up slightly, but I think the point came through. And it's interesting, just the last couple of thoughts from on the chat is that, you know, to this point about uncertainty and risk, you know, both the WEF Global Risk Report and loads of other things had pandemic near the top of their grid for many years. So I think the implicit question earlier on, what else are we not spotting? I think, you know, it's why from a crisis comms perspective, that systematic exercise of risk assessment and scenario planning, you know, if ever organizations were willing to take out the insurance policy of risk preparedness, it should probably be now, I'd argue.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I guess the question, I'm going to ask it of myself and answer it in the same point, but are there any silver linings to this? You know, if you were, one of the risks and opportunities for many companies is activism, which is, you know, been massively on the rise from a small amount of environmental NGOs to, I think, mainstream society is now activist, and I think that's going to continue in its same trajectory. Whereas the world wants to see change, companies have to be part of that change, and comms people are very good at linking the two. So if I saw a silver lining, it would kind of be that. It would be for our industry and our practitioners being able to, you know, to foresee and anticipate and to connect outside change to company strategies, and that's, you know, that's always a good space for a comms person.
Absolutely. Well, that brings us to the top of the hour. We've brilliantly and unplanned ended on a high note with a silver lining and opportunity. Can I just say personally, on behalf of PRCA and all its international partners, sincere, heartfelt thanks to both of you, Max and Mark, for a really excellent webinar. I think people have learned a lot. I think, Cartwright, there'll be a recording posted. I'd strongly recommend, it's fully available on the Deloitte website, to have a look at the World Remade suite of materials. There's much more there that we haven't been able to cover. So thank you both. As always, stay safe and stay well. Thank you to everyone for joining and for all their great questions. and please keep your eye out for more in this series of webinars. Cartwright, if you can just remind us what the next one is and when.
Yeah, so the next one is coming on the 27th, so that's next Wednesday, and we'll be looking at how to optimize client relationships, and we've got a really great panel of experts from the US for that, so do keep an eye out on your emails for that.
Terrific. And Cartwright and team, also thank you obviously for hosting this and making it work seamlessly as a technical exercise. So enjoy the sun for those of you in sunny climes. Stay safe, and we'll see you very soon.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye all.